As a mathematician, John, when you look at the universe, what are some of the evidences that point you to believe that it was created by God?
Well, the very first thing might surprise some people. It's the very fact that we can do science with mathematics. In other words, we discovered that this is what I call a word-based universe. It's describable in a language. And that resonates wonderfully with two things, two central statements in the biblical text. Firstly, the first words of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was God. And then a bit later on, all things came to be through the Word. And there is John explaining how the universe came to exist. It is word-based. It was spoken by God, who is the Word. And in the simpler language of Genesis, but no less profound, you have the constant repetition, and God said, and God said. So one of the things that points me towards God is the semiotic nature of mathematics. It describes the universe in language. And another thing that fits beautifully in with that was discovered relatively recently, and that is the fact that the human genome is the longest word, contains the longest word we've ever discovered, 3.4 billion chemical letters all arranged in a row. And when Francis Collins stood beside the President of the United States and announced that they decoded it, they said, this is the language of God. And there in our genetics, in every one of the 10 trillion cells in our bodies, is a lengthy word. And that, to my mind, speaks directly of an intelligent input from a speaking God. It's a word-based universe. So that's where I would start. And then I would pick up probably from physics, the fact that's recognized by virtually all physicists and cosmologists, that this universe is incredibly fine-tuned to have carbon-based life on it. The basic constants of nature are so precise, have to be so precise, otherwise the universe wouldn't exist. And again, that demands explanation. Every scientist sees that it demands an explanation. But people like the late Stephen Hawking, who was a genius and was in Cambridge around the same time as I was there, they reject, of course, the God explanation, but they come to believe in a universe that created itself from nothing, which to my mind is logically absurd apart from anything else.
John, I'm so glad you're not recommending that people stay away from the tough questions, but you are inviting them into those difficult questions and to explore those things. And that's what I want for my children. And I love that you see studying math almost as a form of worshiping God. Explain what you mean by that. We think of singing as worship or reading the scriptures, but studying mathematics, in what way does that send us into worship?
Well, not quite in the same way. I think if we're singing really good music, you're actually verbalizing things about God. And that is very important because, as I understand worship in its narrow sense at least, it is a response to God speaking. And it's our articulating what we think about God and believe about him. Just to give you a crude analogy, if you want to get people to laugh, you have to tell them a joke. You don't discuss the mechanics of laughter. And if you want to get people to worship, you tell them about God. You don't discuss emotion or anything like that. And therefore, it seems to me the primary source of worship is God speaking to us through his word. But mathematics and the study of nature in general, the heavens declare the glory of God, not only visually, but mathematically. And there's an absolute beauty in some of the mathematics that we study. And it certainly fits perfectly in with the idea that whatever we do, whether it's mathematics or expounding scripture, both of which I like doing, we do all to the glory of God. It's not restricted to what happens inside a church building.
Dr. Myer, your work in The Return of the God Hypothesis and other intelligent design books is so compelling. At least it is to me and to so many others, yet you still have critics. What do your critics say about your work, and how do you respond to them?
Well, typically the thing we hear is not that there is no evidence for intelligent design, but rather that the theory is not scientific, that it doesn't qualify as a scientific theory because it posits, for example, an unobservable designing intelligence. But that's not really a statement about whether or not the theory is true. It's a statement about whether it qualifies as a certain kind of inquiry, namely scientific inquiry. And it turns out that as I've developed the case for intelligent design, I've used the exact same method of reasoning that Charles Darwin used in The Origin of Species. It's a distinctively historical method where you infer a past unobservable state or action in order to explain the evidence that we have at hand. And in fact, there are many unobservable entities that are part of Darwin's theory, unobservable past alleged transitional intermediate species or forms of life, past unobservable mutational events. And many other branches of science also invoke unobservable entities. Theoretical physics, for example, invokes the existence of unobservable elementary particles or fields. But these things are known. We affirm them because if they exist, they can help us explain things that we can see. And so it turns out that if you want to say intelligent design is unscientific or not scientific because it posits a past unobservable entity, you would have to say the same of a lot of other branches of science, including evolutionary biology itself. So there's a kind of a double standard at work in this objection. Whatever intelligent design is, I think it's a historical scientific theory that has larger metaphysical implications. I think we can say the exact same thing of Darwinism. It's an historical scientific theory that has larger metaphysical implications. The two things aren't different types of inquiries or different types of things. They're two different answers to the very same question. How did life arise on planet Earth?
Well, that makes so much sense, and it sounds to me like people who are trying to just find any loophole to get around the answer that seems to be so obvious. I think of forensics. I think of basic things that we can't prove with the historical method because we can't observe those things today. Was Nero really in charge of Rome? Well, we can't go back and find that out through the scientific method, but we can use other things to demonstrate that that's the most reasonable explanation for all the evidence that we find.
Yeah, that's a well-chosen phrase because the method that is used in the historical science, this is sometimes called the method of inference to the best explanation. There are good historical explanations and there are bad historical explanations, and it really depends on how well they are able to account for the data that we have that's left over from the past. And let me give you another example that illustrates why this objection, intelligent design isn't science, is really missing the point. If I walked into the British Museum, or if your viewers walk in and they encounter that beautiful display with the Rosetta Stone, and looked at it for a few minutes, they'd very quickly realize that they were looking at an artifact that had been produced by an intelligent agent, because there before us lies 3 different sets of inscriptions, and they're obviously linguistic. And when the scientists cracked the different codes and understood that they had the same message written in 3 different languages, they realized that there must have been intelligent scribes behind that artifact. It wasn't something that was produced by wind and erosion. But they didn't violate any laws of reasoning or laws of science to do that. They were just using good thinking to infer the best explanation. And when people insist that to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to strictly materialistic explanations, well, there are actually many, many branches of science that already don't do that because they are encountering evidence that is best explained by the activity of an intelligence. So we think that the best approach when we're looking at the origin of life or similar questions is to follow the evidence where it most naturally leads and posit the explanation that, based on our uniform and repeated experience, is best capable of explaining the evidence that we have at hand. And if you have information, the best explanation is a mind. Whenever we see information, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or in a section of software in a computer, or if it's embedded in a radio signal, whenever we see information and trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's what we know from our experience. And therefore, when we find information embedded in even the simplest living cells in the DNA molecule, the best explanation is, again, the activity of a prior designing intelligence. And we shouldn't let our definitions of science prevent us from seeing that reality.
Boy, the more that you talk, it becomes clearer and clearer. Even with a simple example of, I look at a painting of the Mona Lisa, what evidence do I have that there was ever a painter? Well, I would have to have had a lobotomy to think that paintings like that just paint themselves, or perhaps I would have an ulterior motive, and then go to a real living, breathing human being, and then to say that there wasn't a designer behind that is even more preposterous in my estimation.
Well, that's the thing that's so magnificent in our modern era, this contemporary period in biology, is that it isn't just that we have digital code in cells, it's that the digital code stored in the DNA is part of an intricate information storage, transmission, and processing system. And the processing of that information is accomplished by exquisite nanomachines. And so you've got miniature machinery, you've got digital code, you've got an information processing system. There's a kind of circuitry that's involved in coordinating the expression of genetic information during animal development. The complexity of living systems is absolutely mind-boggling, but it's not complexity in the sense of a random array of junk. It's an integrated and functional complexity that's absolutely necessary to sustaining life. And so we're in a new day in biology. When Darwin was writing in 1859, one of his contemporaries, Thomas Henry Huxley, described the cell as a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. The idea was it was just a bunch of simple jello or goo. Well, when that's what we thought life was made of, it was easy to imagine that a few simple chemical reactions could have produced it. But now when we see that life is complex on the order of a factory run by digital code, like one of our modern CAD/CAM systems and beyond, the idea that undirected chemistry could produce the first life is implausible in the extreme. So, and instead, what we're seeing in every realm of biology are hallmarks or distinctive features of life that in all other realms of experience also indicate the activity of a designing intelligence. When you see circuitry, you know that there was an engineer involved. When you see machinery, rotary engines, for example, you know there must have been an engineer. When you see digital code, you know there must have been a programmer. So the 19th century view of life, I think, is no longer plausible.
One of my biggest takeaways from this conversation is what John Lennox says, such as we live in a word-based universe where we can do science using a describable language, such as mathematics. Now, I do not believe that atheism can give a better philosophical explanation for this fact. Again, that the universe can be understood through a language such as mathematics. So if the proposition that we can recognize the universe in a describable way, like language through mathematics, if this proposition is true, again, that we can recognize it in this way, then it also follows that we can philosophically reason to this conclusion in a theistic worldview. Which means that the theistic worldview does make sense, and it's backed upon empirical evidence that we then use philosophy to reason about. Many people say that creationists, they aren't doing science or they aren't using science. But this is false, because without the empirical evidence both atheists and creationists have, we would not be able to make philosophical statements that support intelligent design. And that's one thing that I would love to help the other side, that being the atheists or anyone with an opposing view for creationists, I would love to see them understand that without the empirical evidence that we all have, the philosophical interpretations or explanations of that set of empirical evidence, without that as our foundation, then our philosophical arguments do not work. Therefore, we are using empirical evidence that we see, and here's an example of one, that the universe has a language and it can be described through mathematics. And then you can begin to philosophize what we know about minds and how we understand certain things. Now, there's so much more that I would like to say on this topic, but I thought these two men, that being Stephen Myers and John Lennox, was something very interesting to watch. Wanted to present that to you and give my thoughts on the back end like I just did. Thanks for listening. Have a blessed day.